Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, we received some rare good news from Russia this week. We had a hostage return home. Talk a little bit about that.
So his name is Trevor Reed. He was arrested in the summer of 2019 in Russia. On that summer night, he had been drinking and he was accused of getting into an altercation with the police. He denies it. U.S. officials have said they're trumped up charges,
Right.
and yet he's been detained this entire time. He had somewhat of a sham trial in Russia. He was sentenced to years in prison, and the U.S. has been working through back channels for months now, trying to get him back. And those, or I should say, those conversations had heightened in recent months. And so there are a couple interesting parts of his return.
Sure.
It didn't come without a price. The U.S. had to give up Konstantin Yaroshenko, who is a Russian drug smuggler who had been in a U.S. prison since 2011. He was arrested in 2010 on charges of being a drug smuggler and bringing drugs into the country. And the U.S. gave him up in exchange for Trevor Reed's release. Now, the two of them literally, both prisoners were on different flights. They met in Turkey. The two parties switched prisoners and they got on their respective planes. Now we know that Trevor Reed is back in the United States. There are a number of medical tests that he's going to go through now. While he was in Russia, he contracted COVID, and we heard more recently his parents expressed concern for him. He had reportedly gotten diagnosed with tuberculosis, and his health was rapidly deteriorating, which is something that senior administration officials said played a role in President Biden's decision to make this deal now, was his deteriorating health. Now, that doesn't account for the other Americans that are being held in Russia, specifically Paul Whelan and Brittany Griner. Paul Whelan, who is also a former Marine like Trevor Reed, has been held since 2018, so he's been there even longer. He was accused of being a spy, a charge he denies, and he's still being held there. Now, the Examiner has spoken to Paul Whelan's family, and while they're very happy that the Reeds have Trevor back, they're left with a bittersweet feeling, not really knowing how Reed's return affects Paul Whelan's ability to get home or his freedom moving forward. And so they're still sorting through their own feelings. They talked to the Examiner about how they're a little concerned, was a word they used, because they're not sure how Yaroshenko's release affects Whelan's freedom, because there was conversation about him being released in exchange for Paul Whelan or both of them. And so one thing David Whelan, Paul's brother, mentioned was that he now has a belief that prisoners, U.S. prisoners held abroad, are on separate train tracks, was the way he described it. And so he was under the impression that should a deal like this happen, it would include both of them. And that doesn't even bring up Brittany Griner, a female WNBA player who was arrested a couple months ago in Russia on drug charges, and she's being detained. And so we've heard from the State Department since Trevor Reed's release that they're still working very hard to get Paul Whelan and Brittany Griner's release, but we have no idea of what's going on behind the scenes.
And so while obviously Trevor Reed's return is good news, the concern for the families of the others is that, partly at least, that if you make one concession, that's fewer concessions the U.S. government has available to make to secure the release of others.
Absolutely. And so this was always seen as a possible exchange. And so one other aspect that the Whelans brought up was, why did this deal happen now, considering it was always, it's been known for a long time that the U.S. wanted Trevor Reed released and Russia wanted Yaroshenko released. And so there really are still some unanswered questions about what this means for Paul Whelan and Brittany Griner.
So President Biden has announced another round of aid to Ukraine, talking about a supplemental request to Congress to fund more weapons and money for Ukraine to help in this war effort. Talk a little bit about some of the things that the United States is going to do to help.
So the first thing that we should mention is this number that President Biden requested, $33 billion. slightly more than half, they said about 20 of that would be dedicated for military funding.
Right.
Now that is a huge number. To date, they've only provided about $4 billion of military aid to Ukraine. So we're talking about 5 times the amount they've provided through the first 2+ months of this war.
Right.
So this is hopefully a more longer-term request from the administration, and a lot of this weaponry, as we've seen Biden pass military aid packages in each of the past 2 weeks, the type of weapons that they're looking to provide are changing now. And part of that has to do with the fact that the fighting between Russia and Ukraine is now concentrated in the Donbas region. And so Ukraine doesn't have the same terrain throughout. So when they were fighting around Kyiv, when they were fighting in the south, and when they were fighting in the east, there were different weapons that Ukrainians thought were best suited for those fights.
Right.
Now, being that the fighting is mostly concentrated in the Donbas region, they have requested artillery, they've requested howitzers. The U.S. has now provided, before this new aid request, 90 howitzers and 75 tows for the howitzers, plus over 100,000 ammunition rounds for these weapons. And not only that, the U.S. Is training Ukrainian soldiers in an undisclosed European country, where these soldiers will then learn how to use the weapons and then take that knowledge back home with them, where they can then become trainers. And so they can, essentially the U.S. is training the trainers. And so the first round of trainers, which was about 50 soldiers, has already completed their training, and the second group is there now. Now, this is just on the howitzers. The U.S. has to train Ukrainians on a couple other weapons, and those trainings are also ongoing.
So obviously the war in Ukraine has changed, the terrain has changed, the area of the country has changed, but maybe we've seen a little bit of change in U.S. objectives here too, because they've talked about a little bit more openly about Ukraine winning, and they're talking more openly about deteriorating and degrading Russia's capabilities.
Absolutely. We saw a pretty stark transition from the administration over the last week or so, specifically from the Defense Department. Secretary Austin, as well as Secretary Blinken, traveled to Poland and then actually went to Kyiv, where they were able to meet with President Zelensky, and they had that conversation. Now, the two of them represent the first and only Biden cabinet secretaries to make that trip, to go to Ukraine since Russia invaded on February 24th. So that was a very symbolic gesture. Secretary Blinken said that they would restart diplomatic efforts in Kyiv in the coming days and weeks. President Biden nominated an ambassador to Ukraine, which is another part of this whole step forward to restart and show that the U.S. has optimism and hope for Ukraine to stand. And so not only that, but while Secretary Austin was overseas, he convened a meeting with roughly 40 defense secretaries and ministers globally. And in that meeting, they came up with they re-solidified their support for Ukraine. They announced that they would be doing these meetings monthly. And in the press conference afterwards, Secretary Austin was very clear that in his mind, Ukraine has the ability to win this war. The U.S. wants to help them do that, and the U.S. wants to help Ukraine put Russia in a position where they can no longer make moves like they've made over the last 2+ months.
What do we know about war crimes, alleged war crimes in Ukraine?
That's a great question. So there are a number of different investigations going on. There's one from the Ukrainian government itself, the prosecutor general. Earlier today, she announced 10 Russian soldiers by name and accused them of war crimes. Now, it's the first time we've heard any specific names be attached to war crimes. And when she released their names, she also released their pictures. So a step in that investigation is actually uncovering soldiers who were responsible for these actions. Not only that, but they are working in connection with a couple other Eastern European countries, and the ICC has signed on and joined
International Criminal Court?
Yes, to join their investigation. Now, the International Criminal Court is also doing their own separate investigation, but they'll be working in tandem. And the Prosecutor General of Ukraine has said earlier this week that they've opened up or had allegations for 8,000 different war crimes. And so it'll take a long time for those investigations to keep going and to play out, as will the ICC investigation.
And of course, senior U.S. leaders have labeled Putin a war criminal.
Yes, that at a time that was a statement the administration wasn't willing to make, and as this war is played out, it's another part of the U.S. response to what's happening on the ground that continues to shift.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.